Hi, good day. My name is Abtar. I'm from the Open University Malaysia. Today we are having a very special guest with us, and his name is Roger Mills. And Roger is from the University of London with the Center of Distance Education. For a start, we are going to talk about research in ODL today. So could you give us a brief overview, of the research in ODL? Since you have been with us since the beginning until now, what is your brief take on research in ODL?
My view is that it probably started to be undertaken systematically at the beginning of the 1970s, about 40 years ago. Obviously, there was some research in some small institutions then, but it was the establishment of the national open universities like the Open University UK and like IGNU a little later on, that really drove the research. And the major need at the beginning was that these new institutions had to show to government, to employers, and to their peers in a university section, and to students and potential students, they had to show that they were high-quality institutions offering a program as good as, and in my view, in many cases, better than the programs offered by conventional universities. So the research, in the first instance, the institutional research to show people who the students were who were starting to study in open universities, what their needs were, how well they did, and what happened to them when they got their qualifications was absolutely critical. So that institutional research at the beginning was very, very important. And then after that, of course, came more sophisticated research, more complex research into the teaching and learning process and the way in which students were supported and so on and so forth. But the fundamental thing, I think, driven by the need to convince governments that they were spending money wisely on open and distance learning, was to demonstrate that students were successful. And over the years since then, there have been several meta-analyses of research looking at the types of research done. Liz Burge undertook an analysis of research reports in the journals on open and distance learning for the period 1991 to 1999. Mishra in India did a similar meta-analysis from 1991 to 1996. Olu Jagade, who's the newly appointed Secretary General of the African Association of Universities, did a major report in 1997 on research in distance education. And most recently, in 1999, the International Journal for Research in Open and Distance Learning, that's run from an online journal run from Athabasca University in Canada, published an article by Olav Zvaki-Richer, who had asked about 70 distance educators all over the world for their thoughts and ideas about the priorities of research in open and distance education and what they thought should get the most attention. So there's been a lot done. And there's one more point on the overview of it, may Abtar, and that is that in 1994, I asked Lord Michael Young, who is generally acknowledged to be the man who had the idea of the UK Open University and whose name was mentioned earlier in this forum. I asked him to give a lecture in Cambridge to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Open University. And he chose as his topic the notion that everybody in open and distance learning have been so busy doing it, they hadn't had time to sit back and reflect on it and do the research. So he proposed in that lecture the establishment, as he called it, a lighthouse to shine upon what open and distance learning was doing. And that was the origins of the International Research Foundation for Open Learning.
Roger, on the whole, what are the major trends and findings of the research that has been conducted by distance practitioners?
Well, it's very interesting to think about that, and setting aside the institutional research, as you already mentioned, although that is very important still. I think some of a lot of the research that was done and still is being done on how students learn from the different media is absolutely critical. And Tony Bates from Canada and previously from the Open University first started this by undertaking a lot of research into the use of television and radio and whether students learn from it effectively. And that research in terms of how students learn from the course material and from different kinds of media, telephone teaching in the early days was established, I think Abdul Khan in IGNOU in the early days before he moved to Kaur was involved in television and radio work there. Very important to know whether the spending of money on various media is actually cost effective or whether print is better. And I have to say that I think the early evidence from the UK anyway was that students on the whole did not learn all that much from television relating to its cost. They learned more from radio, perhaps, and more from audio tapes. And eventually we moved away, of course, from live broadcasting anyway to video and stuff like that. But I think that was very important. And I think the other thing that I think is under research, but we can talk about that later, is actually the design, the instructional design, how you design materials for different groups of students. And by its very nature, open and distance learning is generic. You have to design material, and although you know roughly who your students are, every individual student is different, and they have different learning styles and different learning patterns. And the research into that area and how you manage teaching and learning when you've got generic materials, but yet which are studied by individual students is quite a big area. And finally, in terms of work that's been done, I think I still think there's a huge amount of research to be done in the effectiveness of learner support. But there is some significant quantitative research which has been completed that, for example, demonstrates that if an institution proactively contacts students to offer support, that has a definite impact on retention and reduces attrition rates. So
the trends are media, pedagogy, support, assessment.
Yeah.
Trends are repeating. And what about the quality? Has the quality been consistently improving in research? Or is there a way you can say for sure that quantitative methods as compared to qualitative methods are better? Or, what is your view on that, Roger?
Well, very interesting, because 2 weeks ago we had a major day's seminar in London at the Centre for Distance Education. And it was to review the research that had been undertaken in that centre over the last 2 years. And one of the guest speakers at that was Dr. Hilary Perrotton, who has written call books on teacher education and on research, and was the director, as I mentioned earlier, of the International Research Foundation for Open Learning. And I've got a quote from him, and I just wanted to quote his words, because I think he's probably right, but you may disagree, so let's see. He said, too much research on open and distance learning is atheoretical, methodologically weak, and concentrated on day-to-day practice and methodology. Policy and research to guide it at the macro level has been neglected. So just to put that in different words, when these people did these meta-analyses of all the articles that have been published in the journals over the years, they had a common outcome that the vast majority of articles published were descriptive. 60 to 70% of articles were descriptive in the sense, it's not being critical of the people who've written the papers. It's just to say that theoretical and analytical research in not just in open and distance education, but in all of education, is actually extremely difficult, more difficult in my view than it is in science. The other thing to say at this point is that there is a question about who does the research, whether it is particularly highly qualified people in places like the Open University's Institute for Educational Technology, who are very well experienced in social science and educational research methodology, or whether it's practitioners who research their own courses. Whether years ago the International Research Foundation for Open Learning produced for the Commonwealth of Learning a major resource pack called PREST, which is about practitioner research. And this is a significant amount of teaching and learning material to help practitioners learn about some basic research techniques. And that's available freely on the Kaur website to this day, and people can access that. So yeah, I think that there is an issue, but clearly for more sophisticated research, more technical research on things like cost analysis, cost-benefit analysis, you do need specialists to undertake that.
Okay, that is a good overview on the quality of research, Roger. Would you share with us one or two very impactful researches that has been conducted that you could share, and people can pick it up from there, and maybe they can make that as their model?
Yes. Well, I think I mentioned already the effective work on the on learning from the different media. There has been some good research on access and success, demonstrating what open and distance learning institutions can do. But it's never been taken much further than that, I don't think. It's never been taken to the extent that it can show how ODL institutions have increased access and success for students, and how that's impacted on the quality of life in a country, how it's impacted on the economic well-being of the country and the social well-being of the country. And you could say this for all education, but I think more important for open and distance learning, because we are claiming that open and distance learning is the solution to many of the Millennium Development Goals and so on and so forth. And we have got to then start to research that and show it. So there's, I think a lot of the research is halfway through in many ways. I think research into learner support is also very interesting. But again, I think relatively minimal. But I may be wrong. I mean, I'm looking at it from one perspective of somebody based in the UK. But for example, do we really? I think there have been, huge advances as a result of research and student feedback on the way in which course material is written and presented to students. And I think that's very important. And I mentioned earlier the research about the impact of proactive intervention with students, and that is quantitative. It's been shown in the OU UK that if you contact a student by telephone, that's important, not by email, but contact a student by telephone, not by SMS, but by telephone, that will increase retention rates by 7%.
What kind of advice would you give to upcoming and budding researchers in terms of the how, the when, and the what of research?
Yeah. Well, first of all, don't do it on your own. I think that's absolutely critical. I strongly believe that institutions should all have research policies for institutional research, and that people should be expected to undertake their research within an overall institutional policy. So that's methodological and managerial, but I think it's very important. But in terms of topics, well, what do I think? Do we know enough about the outcomes of students who graduate from higher education institutions? I think we don't. I think we know a lot about the impact of ODL on, in terms of rural development for farmers and stuff like that. A lot of work's been done on that, and we can see the outcomes very clearly. But do we know what happens to our ODL graduates? What do employers think about them? Do they get better jobs as a result of doing degrees? They've already got jobs, a lot of them by definition, because they're studying in open and distance learning. But what happens to their promotion prospects? Do they change tack? Do they move? It seems to me that is an area that's under research. That's one area. I mentioned cost effectiveness, and I still tutorials do better than students who don't attend. And I have a suspicion that if you did an analysis, it would be rather like a bimodal curve, and that you'd find some students who never ever go to tutorials do very well, and some students who go to tutorials very regularly do quite poorly. And so it's just a big issue, that, I think.
We thank Roger immensely for sharing his thoughts and his vast experiences in research in ODL. Thank you very much, Roger.
Okay, thank you.